The third type of law that you'll see is cultural laws. Or we could also call them ritual laws. Ritual laws. These have to do with specifically Israel itself. No one else, just Israel. These are things like circumcision. Circumcision is not done by everyone, it's done by Jews. These are things like the 3 major festivals that Israel holds. These are things like, I'm trying to think of some other ones. Meat sacrificed to idols, for instance. Don't eat pigs. Those types of things are cultural or ritual laws. Now, the ritual laws also include those laws about how the temple or the tabernacle should be run, about what God expects of his people specifically in their own land around, without the people around them. A lot of these laws will distinguish Jews and Israelites from those around them. They are distinguishing laws, or laws that make Israel just look different or act differently than the people around them. These laws are also very important as well because they help Israel to identify its own national culture and identity. And everybody has cultural or ritual laws that they use that kind of identify them as opposed to someone else. So these are 3 different ways of looking at the laws. Now, you will see in the whole of Mosaic law, the only thing that the New Testament continues to make us observe as Christians is that first one, and that is the moral law. This one here, the moral law, that is what we as Christians follow on a regular basis, always, and are still held to that standard. And as I mentioned before, if a law is in the Old and New Testaments, it's most likely a moral law that is we are still responsible to follow as we obey Christ and seek him. So those give you an idea of some of the things that are out there and how we can explain the law of Moses a little bit better. So let's talk about the moral law. Let's talk about the 10 foundational laws that make up the moral law. This is called the Decalogue, another word from Greek, deca meaning 10, and log from logos, which is word, the 10 words, the 10 matters, the 10 things that God wants us to observe. And you'll remember behind me, I mentioned this yesterday, that this is a representation of Christ's. And you'll see behind me, as I mentioned yesterday, that this is a representation of what it might have been like to see God coming down on Mount Sinai. We need to remember that all of the law for Israel, and especially the moral law, which is still followed today, was attended by God's presence. God was there with his people. He spoke with them. When you read Exodus 20, you'll notice that God literally, personally speaks these 10 commandments to his people. And Moses is pretty clear actually in chapter 5 here of it, explaining how the people were so afraid of God's voice that they turned to Moses and said, "You go up to the mountain, hear from God, and we will do everything that God tells us through you." They made Moses their intermediary because they feared the Lord. He was literally scaring the people with his power and his presence. And so this is a good representation of God coming down on the mountain, the earth shaking, the thunder, the lightning, the fire, the smoke. And all of that was a representation of the power of God, who is the consuming fire. And his voice, one of the most powerful psalms is Psalm 29, which talks about the voice of the Lord and how the voice of the Lord is so commanding and powerful. And it's one of my favorite psalms, if you haven't noticed. But the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, are split into 2 groups. The first of the 10 Commandments are the first 4, and then you have the last 6. The first 4 focus on our relationship with God, our vertical relationship. And so with the vertical relationship, we're talking about how we respond to God. These are things like, have no other gods before me. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Those are Godward commands.